Cool. Thanks, Danny. Hello, everyone. So I don't have a slide deck for you, not necessarily because I'm not prepared for this, but because I hate slide decks. And especially if you're going to do this right after lunch, you're just going to fall asleep, as I've did many times myself. And since we're going to talk about some real life stories of the things that I do at PingCAP, why are we at GSV, and maybe the stuff that you guys are trying to do with your own company, it's better that I just tell you what I'm doing, and more importantly, why I did what I did, the mistakes that I've made, and I'll spend the first 10, 15 minutes doing that. And I hope that you will just ask me a bunch of questions about why did you do this, why did you do that, why didn't you do that, or if you have your own specific problems that you're thinking about with your own company, just shout it out, and I'll do my best to help you, given the things that I've done and the mistakes I've made, so it will actually be useful for you. So this is just going to be like a dialogue and a discussion, okay? And before we get started, how many of you are like founders of your own company? I just want to get a sense of the room. Just like raise your hand. Okay, so you all have like starting your own company. And how many of you are kind of like working with the founding team as more like an executive member of the company, trying to do stuff? Okay, cool. And also, are all of you kind of companies that started in the non-US market and you're trying to work into the US market in some way? Okay. And Ish, you're not so sure about the United States of America right now? I get it. Yeah, it's all good.
Is it a good market?
Yeah, it's terrible, actually. Yeah. And last question is, how many of you have, just broadly speaking, a two-business product, like a B2B product right now? Yeah, or like your customers' businesses. Okay, and so everybody else is to consumer, I'm assuming? Okay, cool. Because my experience, the work I do now at PingCAP, and I'll tell you what we actually do, is mostly to business. So a lot of the experiences and the things that I do and the reason why I do them are for enterprise sale processes, which actually are very, very different from consumer-facing product. So I have no idea how to get teenagers to sign up for an app. Like, this is just beyond my expertise. But if you want to figure out how to work in a big complex sales cycle and figure out how you can make somebody give you a lot of money after 9 months of talking, maybe there's something I can share with you to help you out, okay? So PingCAP is a database company. So we're a tiny little Oracle, for those of you who don't really know what a database is, but it's basically an infrastructure technology that saves all your data. And the technology is quite complex, actually. And I can go into the technical details of what we do, but that's probably not relevant for this conversation right now. And what we do also is interesting is that we are an open source database company. So any of you like familiar with at least the notion of open source software? So Linux being like the most archetypical example of open source software is that the code is all there. It's downloadable, it's public, you can read it, you can fool around with it, you can use it for free. But big businesses have been built on top of stuff that's actually for free, right? So Red Hat is a really good example that got bought by IBM last year for $36 billion. That's like the largest, I think, transaction in the history of open source. But there are a bunch of other companies that are actually built on top of open source technology. Companies like MuleSoft, for example, that got bought by Salesforce for like $5 or $6 billion. There are companies called MongoDB, for example, which is like an open source database, so on and so forth. So we're in that world, okay? And we raised our Series C last September, and that was like a $50 million round. So we have like $70 million, give or take, in the bank account. Probably a little bit less than that because we spent them. But that's kind of where we are financially. And the context of this company is that it started in Beijing by 3 just nerdy infrastructure engineers who love to make a database. And they raised some money. They got some traction in their so-called first market, which was in China, obviously. And then I started working with the founders, was it like almost 2 years ago now, to launch their North America expansion plan, whatever the hell that means, right? So there's a lot that goes into what that actually means. And I ended up in GSV Labs to find an office space for us. And the reason actually why I came here as opposed to a lot of other choices that are in the Bay Area is that there are a lot of spaces to host events, like this one, like the one downstairs. And that's actually directly relevant to our product and business model, because we're an open source company, and the thing that you actually do a lot in open source company is that you host meetups, you host talks, you host workshops like this, right? But you talk about technology, how to use this, how to use that, why do you use this? And that's a lot of what you actually do to distribute your product, so people will use it, and eventually you can make money off of them later. And my background actually before joining PingCAP was I was in law school and studied computer science for a little while in the same time, so that was really confusing. And also before that, I actually worked in government. I worked in political organizing. I did a lot of campaign work. So a lot of that actually translated to the community building aspect of what I ended up doing, and I still do a lot today. I was just at Google a couple of days ago giving another talk in the evening about our product, which is called TIDB, T-I-D-B. If you Google it on GitHub or just on Google itself, you will find just a bunch of stuff about it, right? So that is the business itself. And I'm just going to pause there for a little bit to see if anyone has any questions about what we do before I get into what I actually did. Cool? Okay. So the fun thing, yeah, go ahead. It's okay. This could disappear and it wouldn't matter. Yeah. And so now back to what we actually did. So I was like hire number 0, right? So the founder met me. We talked about how we're going to do this. But really, what's interesting about companies that come to the US, and this is probably relevant if you were to be a US company going to a different market, is that there are a lot of nuances that you have to pick up as soon as possible about the markets that you're going into, the US being particularly interesting. So number one, obviously, biggest economy in the world still, especially in the enterprise world. There are a lot of large companies that are based in the United States that have a lot of money to spend on softwares like ours, like other things, like Slack, for example, is a very successful enterprise company, right, that a lot of you may use for work. But the nuance with that is, why are they actually spending money when they could probably hire people too? And that's sort of like the second order reasoning, that if you're trying to expand here or you're trying to do something in that realm, that you should think a little bit more critically about, right? It's not just be like, oh, wow, these Americans have so much money, let's get some, right? But like, what is the reason for them spending versus hiring is actually a very interesting dynamic, especially if you're selling tools or softwares like us that directly impact engineers, right? And how many of you are trying to hire engineers for your operation right now? Okay, a lot of you. And are you having a good time hiring engineers? Probably not. It's very complex, right? So I'm actually going to go into specifically the operational aspect of what we do and how I architected this office, and maybe they'll help you a little bit too. So we have about 10 people, broadly speaking, in North America. There are 2 guys in Canada. There's 1 person in Seattle. There's another person in Portland right now, and there's whatever the remainder of that is in the Bay Area, broadly speaking. And there is a very strong movement, especially for technical hires, to be in the distributed setting. So if your core product is just software, you're not like making anything you can physically touch, there's very little reason for you to actually show up in an office, let's be honest, right? You can talk on Slack, we work on GitHub to collaborate, there are a bunch of other tools that you can do or you can implement to make people work well together without making them work in the same place. And that is what I found to be actually one of the most advantageous thing that you could do as a new company in Silicon Valley to hire pretty good technical talent, because chances are nobody knows what your company is, right? Like you'd be like, who are you? Why should I work for this company? But if there are a lot of things you can talk about with the way you organize yourself, like you can call it culture if you want, but really it's just like the way you work. You can actually attract a lot of really good talent. I've personally hired a couple people who've had competing offers from Google, because I was just like, dude, you can work in Mountain View and get free lunches and colorful bikes all you want. If that's what you care about in life, there's nothing I can do to convince you, right? There's only so much money I have. They obviously make way more money than we do as a company. However, we work on some really interesting technical problems. that you can get your hands on literally right away, because there are all these issues that you're seeing on our GitHub right now. These are bugs, these are features, these are stuff that you can work on. This is really cool. You can get your hands on it right away. You can get a lot of satisfaction working on this stuff, and you can live wherever the F you want, right? So this guy lives in San Francisco, which is not that far from here, but I'm like, I don't care if you come here. Like, come here once a week so I can see your face, right? But really, it's not that important to me. And he signed on because he was like, this is actually how I want to work as an individual. This is how I want to be productive, right, as an individual. But the Google side will be like, you got to come down to Mountain View, you got to get on the Caltrain, you got to do this and that. So that's a huge advantage that you can actually leverage as a small team that just doesn't have a lot of that legacy big company silliness if you want to be competitive in hiring, which is pretty much what everyone is trying to do, especially for not just for technical talent really, but even for like good sales leads and marketing and all these other things. So that's just one thing that I did that turned out to work reasonably well looking back, that we will do more of. Any questions about that? Any thoughts? Great. So the stuff that I don't think I did that well is more like the I'm going to call them boring, but they're actually really important operational stuff. Things like accounting, things like running like your regular expenses, having like a good transparent policy for that kind of stuff, your legal affairs, when you have to hire people, you have business contracts, who's actually drafting them, where do you get them from. So a lot of these things that you will find very taxing, because all you want to think about is grow the business, grow the product, and things like that. But my personal experience has been, if you kind of leave that hanging for a little while, it will really catch up to you, and you're just going to have a really, really awful time, as I did, because I wasn't so on top of it last calendar year, 2018, because I was so busy doing all kinds of other things, like hiring people, like going to meetups and talking, and blah, 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 blah. And then like our accounting firm was like, hey, we're going to do financial reconciliation for 2018. And I'm like, what are all these numbers? I don't know. And I have to like go back to my credit card and the company's credit card and do all kinds of things to figure it out, right? And those are the kind of things that won't make you win, but it could make you lose, is how I think about it, right? If you run like an amazing accounting operation, like great. But if you screw it up, it could be really troublesome, especially for our business, because we deal with large enterprises that are very sophisticated in the things that they do, right? So when we talk to them for business deals and we, touch different points of the organization to sell our product, they evaluate you on kind of like how you run your shop, because you are small, right? They could always go to a Microsoft who has like the processes down cold, but we have better technology, so we say. So how do you work with them to make them trust you? And a lot of these little things end up being just like little points of trust that you can convey to these large companies that could be taking a chance on you, that these guys might actually know what they're doing, and we should work with them, right? Sign a small contract, let's grow it out. But all these pieces from the pure operational side of my job is actually really important. So I hope you don't like relegate that because it's just boring work, but to either do it yourself so you understand it, or just hire a really good professional, and you may think it costs a lot, but it really doesn't, to just kind of like take that piece away from you. I think it's very, very important to get that kind of put away, right? And then monitor that accordingly. So there's that. Any questions about that? Yes?
Well, I guess you were incorporated before you came to the U.S.
Sure.
Then you incorporated in the U.S., or you tried to establish something here before incorporating yourselves here. Once again, like you said, it's boring stuff.
Yeah.
But pass it on to a lawyer and let them.
Exactly. So we incorporated in Delaware C Corp, right? That's super boring, super standard. Don't mess with it. I don't even know why you will want to do something creative about that. Like you can do like an S Corp or like a limited partnership or LLC or whatever. Like, well, what is the difference? Like, it doesn't really matter, right? Yeah. But the C Corp is a very standard way, like especially if you're like assuming you're gonna take some kind of outside investment at some point, like either you already have it now, you're thinking about talking to venture investors or other kinds of investors. Like these are just the things that are like really standard that you don't want people to ask you questions about, right? They're just like, oh, C Corp, okay, fine. As opposed to like, huh? Right? And then they'd ask you questions, and you're like, why are we talking about these things when we could be talking about the product and your dream and your market and so on and so forth? But all these little things make people not trust you in ways that are not fair, but it just happens, right? So from like incorporation perspective, like I don't even think we should spend any more than a minute and a half talking about it. Just like get a law firm and do a C Corp and then just be done with it, right? And then the law firm could hopefully help you do other things like employment agreement and contracts, very standard stuff. Don't make it up. Don't look online for a copy and like put your own company's name in it, right? Like it's not really worth it. Like, there's all the standard confidential agreement that you just give to people you want to hire, right? Or consultants or contractors or however you want to hire them. Right? So these are kind of like back office-y stuff. And I think like GSV Lab has a lot of like resources or contacts you can talk to firms or accounting firms about this kind of things. So like those are the things that you don't get creative about. And then there are things that you can get very creative about, which is like the go-to-market strategy. That's like kind of fun. So, any questions about the boring stuff?
Actually,
Yeah.
I have a question about the last thing you said about the hiring engineers.
Yeah.
Do you think as of today, is there any shortage of talent of, for example, computer engineers right here in the Bay Area? Like if I establish myself here and I have to get like to hire some engineers, is there any shortage? Do you think?
Probably. I would say there's definitely a shortage of, well, and then you have to break it down to engineers of different kinds, right?
Like computer engineers.
Sure, right. Like if you're just talking about software engineers who can do like, say, a full stack web application or like an iOS thing, for example. There is, if you want to hire locally, I think there's more, again, going back to distributed theme, there's more options you have actually around the world if you're willing to entertain that. You still have your office here, you have your business here, right? Because this is where you want to do business. But it doesn't really matter that much where you find the programmers if you know how to organize them. There are interesting engineer hubs that are developing in Eastern Europe, for example, right? In like Romania, like Ukraine, like these are like just badass engineers, like honest to God. It's not like, oh, they're Ukrainian versions of whoever and they're not as good. They're just good. And they're like 3 times the cost. Yes, you have to deal with time zones. You might have to have some like communication difficulties or initially here and there. There are things you have to work on, right? To like make sure you work with the team together. So that's challenging. But the advantage, the trade-off is that they are more accessible and they're cheaper and they're just as good, right? There are hubs in, I've heard like Argentina, for example. Like I talked to all these like interesting founders as well. Like how do you run your team? Like where do you find your people? And there are like places in Argentina. I think like there's in Uruguay, there's some good technical talent. There's a lot of these places you would never think of, right? That actually have really good technical talent. So you can fight for the people in Silicon Valley for a little bit, depending on what kind of product you're doing. So this guy that I'm going to call it, I pried away from Google. He is just one of the best in the field. So he used to work at Mozilla Foundation, and he was actually the creator, or one of the creators of the programming language that we use to build our foundational product. It's this language called Rust, which for the geeks of you out there is like a new, hippier version of C++, which is like, you know, awesome, cool features and memory safety and all these sort of things that C++ doesn't have, right? And like he created the thing, and we use it, right? So for me, it's like, I'll get this guy at all costs, you know, up to a range of like what my budget allows, but he's here, and I was willing to spend time to find something like that. But if that's not like your requirement, it's just very special to our product, then look outside this area. Even in the United States, actually, there are a lot of good places in the Midwest of the United States, you know, in Ohio, in Illinois, in all these places that I guess people who are not from the United States don't go to technically, but there are good, smart people there. I almost hired a guy who lives in Missouri, which is in the middle of the United States as well. And you know, they're just engineers, right? So be very open to that, because frankly, if you're just trying to fight where everyone is fighting, which is here, you're not gonna get a lot of success. And you're just gonna kind of spin your wheels and be mad about it. So that's both my take and I think my experience doing this. Yeah. Any other questions before I talk about other things? Yeah.
So you mentioned about just BSc
Yeah.
say don't make it too complicated. But what are the options? What are the pros and cons? Do you have something?
Yeah. So being someone who went to law school but never practiced law, my advice is going to be very, very nuanced and like not qualified or like half qualified. But basically C Corp is just a very standard corporation type, I think, that lets you take in outside investments very easily. So literally every single company in the Silicon Valley realm, like there's some goofy ones that started out as an LLC because they didn't, think about it through. I think Facebook actually was an LLC in Florida, right? Before they were starting to take outside investment, like guys, just put it into a C Corp. Like, why are you, fooling around with this? So do that, and that's the reason why is there's the investment ease of kind of compliance or structure. So when you talk to investors, that's just a question you don't have to answer anymore, right? Which is great. And then there are probably like other good things in terms of Delaware being a jurisdiction for corporate law that is actually very, very sophisticated because everything is registered there. And being a C Corp, if you ever get sued or something, I don't know, they're like easier ways for you to like just kind of socialize this kind of stuff. Like that's kind of beyond my expertise at this point, but the options are just not really worth it, in my opinion. Anything else? Yeah.
Do you have any, so I'm sorry if I missed this up in the late, but do you have any kind of, we talked about a lot of stuff that everybody knows you're going to have to do and what you're creative about it.
Yeah.
That's even, at some point you're going to have to hire salespeople and operations people.
Right.
Do you have like easy metrics that when you went, it was time to incorporate the US, when it was time to hire a
Right.
full-time salesperson?
Yeah.
What that was?
Yeah, so that's the fun stuff that we should talk about, right? Because I think a lot of people here intuitively understand all these things that you should do and have to do. But I think the more interesting question is why do you do it when? Like, why should I do this first versus this thing second, right? Like, that's like the harder thing because it's more about prioritizing than it's about like knowing what to do because you all kind of know what to do, right? And like starting from the very beginning, the incorporation stuff is probably just the easiest thing that you should do in the very, very beginning because when you start hiring people and you have to divvy out, say, stock options, for example, right, to get these people to come on board, again, like the C Corp structure is just like a very easy thing that you deal with in terms of having employee option pools and all these kind of stuff. And it's just very easy to do that. Where like the S Corp is like a little weird, I think, or like not as standard. So that's like another reason, right, going to your question. So just like incorporate that kind of stuff, right? And then once you have these very basic structure, this foundation down, you should start actually figuring out what you want to do with this go-to-market strategy with your product. So being hire zero, and this was more like a conscientious decision on my part, is to actually try to do everything myself at least once, if not twice. So everything being obviously hiring people when I need them, but actually do the job first before you try to hire, even like the technical stuff. So if you're gonna do the go-to-market stuff, right, you think, oh, maybe I need a marketing person, right? In my world, you actually don't immediately need the typical marketing person that you would think. What I did for just like 6 months, and I did a lot of that stuff in GSV Labs, is I just like hosted a bunch of meetups, right? So, oh, come to this meetup. I want to talk to you about TidyB, our product. And people are like, huh, right? And then they come, maybe you talk to them about it. These are your users. That I know, right? So these are like engineers that will eventually start playing around with our product. So I do want to get to interface with them as quickly as possible to get some of their questions, to kind of know what they care about. Even though I have some understanding, I want to get that as quickly as possible before I started thinking about hiring a marketing person or like a content person, right, to start writing blogs, for example, or tutorials, and these things that I know will help our product get more traction at a scale. So that's what I did first. And I also did that to raise some awareness of the product itself and figure out what are good ways for people to actually hear about this, right? Like that's always kind of like a hard thing to figure out as quickly as possible because you want to be able to obviously get there as quickly as possible, but there are also different tactics that you should engage in. So Meetup is the offline stuff that we do a lot. There are obviously online things that we do when it comes to publishing and things like that. So I do them once or twice, And then I start looking for people who could do this better than I do. And then I move on to the next thing, which is, I hired some engineers, obviously, because actually part of our product wasn't quite ready for this market, right? So I'm sure you all heard about the cloud, or like cloud computing, right? Like AWS and things like that, right? You probably all use them to like bootstrap your own initial version and things like that. And for us as a database company, it's very important for us to actually have an offering on these platforms, or these cloud computing platforms, so people like you or other companies could use them, right? That was our goal. And it took us a while to figure out that priority. And it wasn't until like mid last year when I was like, hey, we need people who actually know how to build things on the cloud, who have had a lot of experience working in AWS or GCP or all these sort of platforms, right? And I wouldn't be able to have done that if I started doing that right away. I might have hired some wrong person. So then I started bringing this other person on. His name is Greg. He still works here. And he's like our first cloud product engineer, right? So we kind of like framed that in a way that made sense to him to join us as well. So that's like on the product side. And then I did more. And so after that, you have some awareness, you have some traction, you have a product to sell, sort of. And then you start thinking about selling, right? And then as you sell and you go through these really complex enterprise sales cycle, you start to look for salespeople too that are going to be better than you at selling. So that's kind of the rhythm that I kind of figured out is the right way to do it. It may not work for you, right? Especially for consumer products. The selling, I think, is a little bit different. If you're like selling ads, for example, you may just grow your user base until it's like a gazillion people before you start monetizing. So you don't really have to worry about that. For us, you kind of have to sell and then market, but like sell again to figure out your value proposition, and you hone your playbook, your sales playbook, and you make that more efficient and things like that. So it's a bit more like short-term iterative. And also the other thing is that I personally think is important to be as aggressive as possible on the kind of the awareness marketing side initially, just so people know who you are, especially in whatever industry that you're in, right? I'm in a database industry, so I do a lot of like database related like PR and things like that. You might have your own world. The reason is if you aren't known, at least on a superficial level, you're just not going to get very good people to come to your company either. Like no one's going to work for a company that they've never heard of, right? Or no one's going to work for a company that will take me, the person who's trying to hire, like an hour to tell you about it. Like chances are, ideally, when I pitch it to someone or I get some applications, they're like, oh yeah, I did some research, I saw your company, it looks really interesting, I want to pursue this opportunity, right? And for me, I also kind of look for that sign as well when I hire, because by definition, we are an open source company. A lot of our stuff is open in public. It's an opportunity for recruits or interested candidates to actually do their research and then come talk to me. So for the ones who like didn't really say anything initially, so we put a lot of ads or job posting on AngelList, right? I don't know if you guys know the platform, but like AngelList actually work really well for us for hire all kinds of different things. And there's this like little feature where you can write a note before you submit your application, right? If the note doesn't mention anything that's specific to PingCAP or TidyB, the product, I just kind of move on, because this is going to be a huge waste of my energy to talk to a person to convince them when they haven't actually done a lot of the research themselves, right? Or like my initial screen call is usually like 30 minutes if I look at someone whose resume is interesting. I always actually tell them to like ask me questions first, right? Like instead of like me interviewing them, which I frankly don't even have the leverage to do, I just be like, hey, thanks for reaching out. Like you probably saw something on our website, any questions that I can answer for you. And we do that for like 20 minutes. And if they don't have really good questions, it's also kind of like good for me. It's like, oh, he's not actually that interested. It's like, all right, cool, move on, right? Because the other thing you don't have is like a lot of time. Like if you're founders, I don't know how big your teams are and everything, but chances are you just never gonna have more time than you need, or yeah, that's how I would frame it. And there are like all these little tricks and tactics you can make yourself more efficient by being out there. And like, don't be too afraid to be out there anyways, like it's just not, like you just kind of have to fight for this attention span situation. And then you can get like really good, people to come in. So the person where we're doing like our enterprise sales hire, for example, the guy that I really wanted which I didn't get, but we can talk about that later. He knew us already, and he's like a VP from a competing company, right? And like there's this ranking of database products that's like just in our world. He's like, oh, you guys are climbing so fast, like, oh, this is interesting. Like he wouldn't have said any of that when I first started because nobody would know us, right? A year later, after all the work we did, I could access someone like that level of talent that I wouldn't be able to get if I didn't do all this other stuff in the beginning. Any questions about that? I'm gonna get some water. Talking lots. No?
Any interesting free ways of getting your brand out there outside of paid acquisition right now? Other than Meetups?
Right, so Meetup actually is not free either, right? Like unless you guys are making the room free, which you're not gonna do. Right, exactly. So because, and this is something just like free advice to everybody. So before I did PingCAP, I did a lot of media outreach work. So I was working in communications in the government and on like political campaigns, like I said. And the kind of the industry operative term is you get earned media as opposed to paid media, right? So paid media, everybody understands, is like ads that you pay for, right? Earned media is things that you quote unquote earn, but it's really just stuff that you do that is interesting that other people will publish for you for free if you're willing to put the content out there for them to publish. And one thing that you should understand in terms of the media is that it's not an industry that's doing really well. Everyone's trying to like put out good content. At least for our industry, there's like 5-6 trade publications, right, that writes about infrastructure software or open source software as their day job, right? And they need content all the time. So if you're just willing to write stuff or produce things for them for free, they will publish it for you because they don't have the staff to do it themselves because no one is sadly making a lot of money being journalists these days, which is like a societal problem that we don't have to talk about today. But for you as a founder though, if you want to like get ahead or like get noticed without paying anything, figure out what these people or these outlets are. I'm sure all of your industry has people who just cover this stuff for a living, and then just reach out to them. Be like, hey, I'm founding this company, it does this, you've written about XYZ before on your outlet, I wrote this blog post, do you want to publish it? And actually like, better than half of the time, they probably will at least entertain it, right? So that's what I did initially, because I kind of knew how that world worked. So I just figured out, oh, these are like 5-6 different outlets that talk about databases all the time, right? And I just like find their editor's email. Like go to the editors. Don't go to the people who actually write stuff. Go to the people who like tell the people who to write stuff, right? So they're called editors. And then just email them and just be like, hey, I have this idea. I wrote this blog post. This is a draft. What do you think? And they're like, oh, okay. Looks good, right? And then you kind of generate a little bit of momentum. They'll share it out on social media. You don't have to do it for them. And then that gets you a lot of bang for your buck, I believe, let alone like the SEO things that you can direct back to your website and stuff like that. Yes?
So on that, you just you publish it on your website. Does that mean they can
Mm-hmm. You can. So they all have different policies, but really the typical policy is just that if you want to contribute your writing to a known media outlet of some size, they usually just ask for like a 2-week exclusive, which means they run your article for 2 weeks and you just sit, and then after 2 weeks you can post it on your company website, on your personal website, like wherever you want, right? So it's just like a 2-week lag. You just talk about it before you publish it. Be like, what is your exclusivity, policy? Any questions on that or anything? Cool. What should we talk about now? Well, I can talk about just the guide that I didn't get, maybe, because I think that's actually very instructive for either you as founders, or if you are a founder and you're potentially looking for someone like me to help you break into a new market, right? So I think that relationship is actually really interesting and is also kind of analyzed, in a sense, because chances are, because you're a founder, you have very strong will and vision in terms of how you want to do things, right? Wherever you come from, you want to come to US, you want to break in, you're going to learn a lot, but you also want, as quote unquote, like local people to like help you out, right? And there's that very healthy kind of disbelief that's actually going on, or skepticism towards each other. Like, do I really listen to this person? Is he really telling me the right thing to do? Or should I like go about my own way and learn about it myself? And the reason that this really, I think, really good sales prospect didn't work out was because I actually didn't have very good alignment with my founders on this particular hire. Because they're all engineers, I had a relatively easy time actually pushing engineer hires through because they have good intuitions about what a good engineer looks like. I came up with some technical exercises, they do them, we talk about technical issues, I have enough technical background where I can like, have a good conversation about it, we share the notes, they're like, oh cool, looks like a good engineer, like, sign off. And then when it comes to non-technical hires, like sales and marketing, for example, it became a lot more difficult. And it wasn't a conversation I actually had with them initially, even before I first joined the company, which I wish I had, which is like, hey, let's talk about all these other things that you actually aren't experts in, right? Like you are an expert in making databases, but there are all these other things that you have to do to build a successful company that has nothing to do with the database itself. So we should have a lot of alignment on, how do we think about these people? Who should you trust when it comes to these decision-making process? And for founders, it's probably really hard to actually trust, or delegate people because you're also capable, you're also involved in everything. But at some point, you do need to think about how do you let go? Because otherwise, it's number one, very difficult for the people who really do want to help you and work with you to grow and help you succeed. But also, you could never do everything yourself, right? I think it's kind of like a fallacy to think like these founders are just like mysteriously godlike powerful people. When you really look back at all the history of the ones that you like idolize in whatever, kind of your favorite company, I guess, like in Silicon Valley, there's always like a few other people that you've never heard of that made it work for them in ways that they couldn't do themselves, right? Like Google had a professional CEO at like year 7 or something, right? Because the two guys who figured out PageRank couldn't actually make the business work that well, right? Like Mark Zuckerberg had Sheryl Sandberg. One of the companies in our world called HashiCorp, which is like a really interesting open source company, 2 engineer founders as well. By like year 3, they're like, we couldn't grow this company because we didn't really know how to do all this like business stuff. We're really good at the technology. And they had the self-awareness to actually find a professional CEO. It actually initiated that process, which is really, really incredible, I think, in my opinion, because usually it's like your investors telling you to do it. It's like, you guys are screwing up. You're not making any money. We're going to replace you if you like don't hit these goals. And these 2 guys are like, yeah, we're not really going to be good at this, but we really do want to build a big company. Let's find help, right? And they found this guy who used to work at GitHub as like their VP of marketing and stuff like that. So there's all these like really interesting stories that I think is way beyond what I have done, but I certainly learn a lot from these experiences, that whether you're like a technical founder or you're like a non-technical founder, you should probably think more about what you're not good at and be just really objective about it and do your best to find people who are good at those things, and hopefully you can attract them to work for your vision and then give them enough leeway or flexibility to run with it. And if you didn't work out, just fire them, right? I mean, you should do it nicely, but yeah. Yeah.
So if you can go back in time when you were hiring your software engineers,
Mm-hmm.
would you like take in mind all those multidisciplinary things like no marketing, or you wouldn't mind if they don't know anything about marketing?
You're talking about the engineer hires?
Yeah.
I think the marketing stuff is probably not that important for engineers to have a sense of. I do think there are 2 kinds of engineers, 2 broad kinds. One are the ones that just like engineering for engineering's sake. So these are the people who like to optimize things because you can. These are the things who like to play around with like a Raspberry Pi or something just because you can, right? Which is kind of fun if that's what you get paid to do. But the better ones, and I think those are the ones that actually are found more in the Valley, if you can get them, is engineers with really good product sense. So what I mean is that there is a little bit of like a business intuition in this person's head.
They can take more value in what they are doing, right?
They can take more value, and also they can actually help you more because they can actually think about the way you engineer. Like, why do I build this? Isn't because I think this is cool, but because this could actually help the product grow. Well, what is the product, right? So you can be like, what do you think the product is? Like, you know what the product is because you thought about it. But a lot of good engineers have good product sense too. So, I actually do want to build this because I'll get these kind of people to use it. And that will be really helpful because we have an ad model that's going to support this at some point, right? So it helps them prioritize, it gets them really excited. So engineers with product sense is really, really hard to find. But those will be the ones that you can kind of test out as well, as opposed to the ones that likes engineering for engineering's sake, which isn't as valuable, but they could appear very valuable because they're really good engineers. You'd be like, I just want this person because he's such a good engineer, right? But you like do all these things that are like kind of irrelevant to your business, and you only have like 5 people on the team anyway, so you gotta like make sure everyone's like rolling in the same direction. So.
Would it be like sort of a good idea to hire a pair of the first type of engineers that you said
Yeah.
in order to make your product or service more scalable? Because you have like the product sense team,
Yeah.
but maybe you need like a team with a sense of optimization, as you said,
Yeah.
for your scale,
Yeah.
the existing product. Do you think is it like important at the first steps of your startup?
Right. I think it's always better to hire engineers with better product sense than ones that are just pure engineers. Realistically, you as the founder,
But a mix of both
Mhm.
will make like a good team. Or do think
you mean
it
like a
will-
mix of both?
Yeah.
Huh.
Because you have the
So you have like the one pure engineer, and then you have like the product-ish engineer, which is like not actually your PM, and you're like putting them in a room. It's like, go.
yeah.
I've never seen that in real life before, so the prerequisite being you can find those 2 people to begin with. But so I don't have a real evidence that I can answer your question. My intuition is more like less about the type, but maybe how they think about working together. So one thing that we do during our engineering hire is that I would always have the engineer who's actually going to work with this prospective engineer that we're going to hire do just a technical discussion, maybe like a pair programming session. And even if they're far away, you can do it. Like you just like launch your Google Hangout, like you share your screen. It's like, oh, here's some code. Like, what do you think? How do you solve this problem? There's like a bug here. Oh, okay, we see a bug here, right? And then you kind of observe how they jive, right? Their engineers, whether they're product engineers or just like the pure engineers, are super, 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 super opinionated about the right way to do things. Those are a little bit hard to work with because every problem has at least 10 ways to do it, right? Every technical problem, there's like 10 different ways to get there. Some are a little bit hacky, some are more elegant, some are faster, some are slower. But you don't want people who are like super kind of like my way or the highway, right? And those people will be like really hard to deal with once you actually bring them in.
Also, you say that co-working is like super essential for hiring engineers.
What's that?
Like co-working
Yeah.
for engineers for you like essential in your team.
Yeah. Like I think collaboration is super important, right? Like, is there a question? Is there more? Yeah. And I would say for engineering too, another thing that I've discovered that's also a little bit underappreciated is that a lot of people pay attention to the code, but not enough people pay attention to the documentation or the comments that explain the code. So if you actually have a really good code base, right? What makes it good? Yeah, the thing probably should work, but it's actually very important to see the comments, right? This is like regular English, right? This is not computer language anymore. It's like, explain, why is this function here? Like, why did you make this? How does this library work? Why did you use this and not that? So documentation, which is actually like a writing skill, is something that we over-evaluate or overweight when we evaluate engineers, because when you're a distributed team, you just don't get to sit in a room that often, right? So you communicate via written communication, via documentation, and you have to be able to explain your reasoning better than normally do. Even if your solution isn't the optimal one, it's actually better to have someone who's better at explaining what he or she is doing than someone who may have gotten to the right answer, but there's like no work shown, right? And that is really hard for other people to work with you, because why did you do this? Like, do you even know why this worked, right? So that's something that you can actually evaluate even if you're like not a very technical person, because we can just all read and be like, do I get it, right? Is this like a clearly formulated sentence or not? So, yeah.
So I have a question based on the documentation where
Yeah.
how do you prioritize, especially in the startup, prioritize documentation over like getting stuff done. Sometimes documentation takes a really long time. So
Right.
would you like tell your engineers like finish this code and then do documentation, or is it kind of all done together?
Well, I mean, from like a building or like a sprint, perspective, you should always actually probably finish the code and make sure it works before you document why it works or why it doesn't work. That being said, I don't think it's a good idea to make documentation optional, right? It's obviously, you don't have to tell people to make the code work because that's like their job. But the documentation part could start to lag really quickly if you don't kind of stay on top of people to be like, hey, like just document this stuff, right? And you can find engineers who actually really enjoy documentation. We luckily found a couple who just loves to document everything, right? They actually love to write code and write in regular English. And those are the ones that are maybe also underappreciated in some other companies. So that's another leverage you can gain and be like, hey, we actually really appreciate your documentation skills. Like, write about it. Don't just, write the code, And they can turn into even interesting blog posts that you can use as content on your website and for these earned media outlets. There are a lot of things you can like kind of copy and paste and like make one little thing really, really valuable for other kinds of things, right? But I do think documentation is important to work together as engineering team, but also for new hires especially. That's like the other underappreciated thing, is that when you have a new person that comes on board, they're like, what the F is going on? And it's really, really good to have good structured documentation. Be like, hey, you're probably not gonna handhold this person because you already have like 10 other things to do. Here's like a pretty good documentation. I'm available for questions, but go enjoy for like a week, right? Like your first week. And then maybe they're really self-initiated, they can figure things out, and it'll come back with questions. And you can kind of like shortcut the onboarding process that way. Like you don't have big company resources to like put everyone in the auditorium and be like, let's have team building exercises, right? Like you can't do that. So, yeah, I'll go to you first, and I'll come at you.